Reporting on the games you love by people who love to game. The MMO Reporter Network.
Hello and welcome to episode 31 of the Happy Hearthstone podcast. I am your host, Josh Augustine, and this week I'm joined once again by the illustrious, the esteemed Scott Lantz.
I'm illustrious and esteemed now. When did that happen?
I know, apparently, in the past 5 seconds.
Oh, hey,
congratulations. Your
thanks.
illustriousness.
That's good stuff.
Yeah, so for those that don't remember, Scott was here, what was that, maybe a month and a half ago? 2 months ago?
I think it was, I want to say late February, mid-February, something like that.
Yeah, so you came and you gave a lot of tips about how to play an arena, specifically for 2 classes. I can't remember which 2.
Paladin and Shaman.
Paladin and Shaman, then also a lot of general arena tips. We got a lot of awesome feedback from listeners that they really liked having Scott on the show and liked having his insights. So we're dedicating an entire episode to Scott the teacher today. He's going to teach us all sorts of stuff. I'm going to be sitting alongside you guys, put on my headphones, and Scott's just going to lay down some life lessons for us.
Well, I don't know about life lessons, but card evaluation.
That's good. All right, card evaluation lessons, probably a little more applicable here. But Scott, if you have some moral teachings you want to throw in there, don't be afraid.
I'll see what I can do.
All right, so let's talk about why we're happy this week. I'll go first. One of my best friends since forever, essentially, Greg Henniger. I used to live up in San Francisco. He moved up to San Francisco. We worked at the same place. I moved down to San Diego, and he just got a job at SOE where I work, doing community manager for H1Z1, a new game we're making. So me and Greg, best friends since like 3rd grade, are back together again. I'm excited.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's kind of weird how it worked out. We keep changing jobs and moving across the state, but we always end up at the same place. It works out really nice.
Huh.
So how about you, Scott?
Well, for me, I'm happy to be on the show. So thanks for that, Josh. That's always a pleasure. I don't know, last time, I'm not sure if it showed through, but I was so sick the last episode. I just missed the better part of a week of work. I missed another week of work after that show. It was the most work I've ever missed in one stretch. And I tried to put on my brave camper face and do the episode last time. But this time, none of that. I'm feeling great.
There's a little more pep in your step this time. You sound enthusiastic.
Oh man, yeah, I can afford some enthusiasm this time. I was dead last time. So anyway, here I am, all peppy. And just right before we started recording, I wrapped up a 9-win run in the arena. And then when I opened the pack I got from that, I got the Black Knight, one of the legendaries. So that was pretty sweet.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Thanks.
So what was more exciting, the 9-win run or opening the Black Knight?
Well, the Black Knight for sure, because I was 8-1 and I thought, oh man, this could be my third 12. I'm gonna do this, and then of course I just fall apart immediately after.
So who were you playing as in arena, and what were the key cards that you got?
Hunter. Hunter has just been doing it, and it's
Unleash
not
the Hounds nerf. What?
Yeah, it was a good nerf. The class needed it, the card needed it, but Hunter's still just as strong as it was before. It's fine.
Okay. Going aggro, I assume, or are you going control?
Actually, it was more mid-range. Trying to think. I took a beast whenever it was offered for the most part. I mean, I had some limitations and I was watching my mana curve, but the games that won out for me, it was just high efficiency. I had that High-Mane Prowler, I think that's 6/5 for 6 that drops 2/2.
Yeah.
2/2s when it dies. That thing is crazy efficient. Just the 3 animal companions in that deck, just stuff that I don't necessarily know what's going to happen, but it's going to be good no matter what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it worked out.
Nice. Yeah. Mid-range decks seem to be like the new hotness, because for a while we've only really had like hardcore control. Like remember the early mage that was just like all freeze and damage, and then we had hardcore aggro with Warlock and Hunter. And it's nice to see this kind of mid-range start filling in, because that's kind of the third in the holy trinity of Magic decks that always kind of kept themselves in balance.
Yeah, it's kind of a rock paper scissors where the slightly slower stuff will tend to beat stuff that's slightly faster than it, but the really fast stuff will tend to beat the really slow stuff.
Yeah. So it's really good to see mid-range step in because we had the question on last week's show or last 2 weeks ago show was, do they need to nerf aggro? Is it too much of a problem? And mid-range is kind of the answer to aggro, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So I'm excited to see more of that. So you said Unleash the Hounds nerf was good. I think the same thing. I'm a little sad that it happened, right? Just because I don't know. I feel like Hunter is already starting to kind of drop down in the tiers a little bit, and this feels like it's maybe going to punt him a little too far in ranked, but it's good. It's good. Too many people were getting just too frustrated by that card, so it makes sense.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, so this week we're not talking about Unleash the Hounds. We're talking about card evaluation. Basically, how to know if cards are good. And when you look at a choice of 3 cards in the arena, for example, because this is where it happens most often, how to evaluate their value compared to one another and how to pick the right one. So, Scott, I'm just going to let you take over from here because Scott has built this awesome guide. I'm just going to play the role of the dumb student. I'll ask questions, but you take the lead, man.
All right. Well, and jump in too, because one of the first things I want to say is that this is all very subjective. There may be concepts actually, for the most part, I think the concepts are going to be universally agreed, but there may be specific cards that I apply some concepts to and say, man, that's not very good. And you say, that card's great. And so I am almost certain to badmouth some card in here that each person thinks is fabulous.
So listeners, get your rage emails ready. Fire them away at scottlantz@gmail.com. I actually don't know if that's your email.
No, not at all. But that person would probably appreciate the feedback. All right. So, and a couple other like introductory things. I mean, one is in collectible card games, there are better and worse cards on purpose. Designers. I used to think that if a CCG was being done right, all the cards are perfectly balanced. They're just good in different situations or different synergies. And I've come to realize that that's actually very much not true, that the designers intentionally, and it's a good thing to do, that the designers intentionally put in better and worse cards. And there's a number of reasons for that. And some of them is that even cards that are bad in most formats are actually good in some specific theme deck or synergy or format. But also that it's meant to help test the skill of the person playing the game. And, even when you're just reading cards, trying to figure out what cards are good and bad, like that makes you feel successful as a player to properly identify the good and the bad cards. So there are bad cards and there are good cards. And that's kind of what this whole episode is about, is learning to spot the difference between the good and bad cards. Mostly we're going to be paying attention to in general or in arena where synergy is not a huge thing, but certainly knowing where a card fits in a certain deck would be important too. And I really do think that of all, for anybody looking to get better at Hearthstone, of all the skills that you can pick up and learn, I really think that card evaluation is probably one of the fastest to get up to speed on, and probably will help your game by the biggest margin of any, however long we record here. The next hour of your life is going to be the best Hearthstone invested hour.
Yeah, because a lot of this stuff is just logic, right? The thing is, when you enter a card game, it's not that you're dumb or stupid. You don't know the construct that you're working within. You don't know the rules of the environment. Mm-hmm. And this is about learning the rules and how things work. And once you get that, it's just a lot of logic. Like, oh, I see why this is valuable once someone explains to me that this is what it does, essentially.
Yeah, and some of these, a lot of the stuff we're going to go through is kind of obvious. It's just making sure to think about it. Mm-hmm. But some of these concepts are, I think, sort of a fresh way of looking at things that have been pulled from various sources, other hardcore players and communities and such. So I think of these as like tools in the tool belt or perspectives. I've felt one way about a card, and then I look at it through a different lens, and I'm like, oh, wow, that bad card is actually pretty good if I think about it this way, or vice versa. And what's interesting there too is it's not saying that the card is actually better or worse than I thought it was, but it calls out in a way how to use it or how to think about it so that I can wield it most effectively or know how to avoid those situations where I think it's bad.
Yeah, would you agree that it's probably true that there are very few cards that are good or bad, but just some have more uses than others, essentially?
I think there's definitely truth to that, yes, but I think there are some cards that are just bad, and I think there are some cards that are just good. I think it's most of them I think are probably pretty close to each other, and that's kind of what you're saying is, knowing when and how to use them and having circumstance come up for them. But I really do think that there are some cards that are just like the level of risk in playing them is just too high to be worth it. But we'll get into that a bit later.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Also, there are ranked lists out there. What we're not going to do here is we're not going to just run through all 300 cards from best to worst and tell you what order to pick them in. That's not at all the point of this exercise. This is to get each person thinking about how they value cards and building that skill so that when they see either an individual card or a selection of cards that they kind of know what to make of that on their own. And that'll help. A, I think it's more fun that way. And B, it helps when new card sets come out, so you don't have to like wait for the community to figure it out. You can actually be at the forefront of figuring out. You can have more fun by feeling more engaged with it. And I also think that card evaluation depends a bit on individual play style. So I have ways that I like to play. I like card advantage. I like resource advantage. I'm very cognizant of like thresholds, like, Josh, if you've got a 2/2, I want to try and attack it with my 3/3, so I'm left over with my 3/3. Like those are things that I do. So I'm going to look for cards that and I'm going to evaluate cards higher that tend to complement my play style. And so since every person has different things that they're good at and things they like to think about, that means the card evaluation does and should value or vary a little bit per person.
Yeah, and
so again,
especially if you're playing in non-hyper competitive, because I mean Hearthstone is a game, right? And especially if you're kind of new, sometimes you aren't playing like always to win. Sometimes you just want to have fun, and sometimes I mean those crazy combos. I mean sometimes when I go in, I value those highly because I just want to have fun. And so sometimes it's like, yeah, like I know that this isn't super efficient, but it has a really cool combo that I could pull off. I'm going to try for it.
Yeah, exactly. So, if you're ready, Josh, we can start going through the concepts. We'll probably start at the easier ones and go to more complex ones from there. But the main goal of all this is just to help get people familiar and interested in looking at the value of a card.
Yeah, so you have about 10 different tests here. Are these supposed to be like independent? Like you do each one of these 10 things individually? Or are they complementary? Do you do them in the same order we're talking about here? Or how do people use this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know that anybody has a checklist that they go through, in some sort of finite order, but
yeah.
These are sort of tools in the tool belt. Simpler cards will tend to be looked at one way, and then like one of the first things we'll go into is the vanilla test, and I think that everybody will learn to sort of run things through the filter of the vanilla test very quickly, and you don't even have to think about it. And then later on, some of the concepts will be different. Like there's no use in comparing keywords on cards if they don't have keywords, so you can ignore that one, or
Okay.
So I think in general, probably if I were to wave my hands, maybe like 3, maybe 4 of these would apply to any given card. But again, it's something that's just sort of knowing that these are out there, having been exposed to these, having thought about each of these a little bit. And we'll give some examples as we go and some thought exercises, and just kind of get people used to looking at cards through these lenses. It'll become second nature.
Cool. Sounds good. Let's jump right in.
Yeah, so the first one, and it was talked a little bit about on your last episode, it's what people refer to as the vanilla test. And the idea here is if you pretend that a card doesn't have any special abilities, and some don't, so that it's easy to pretend, you just look at their stats compared to their cost, and you say, is this good? Now in Hearthstone, there aren't a whole lot of truly vanilla creatures, and so they don't tend to compare to each other like, oh, hey, look, this one's just blatantly better than that one. I think there's only one vanilla creature at each casting cost, and I could be missing one in there, but I think that's correct. And so, but this helps set the good baseline. And then the rough rule of thumb that we use here is cost times 2. For the combined attack and health plus 1. So as an example, Chillwind Yeti is a 4-cost 4/5. So if you add the power and toughness, or the attack and health, you get 4 plus 5 is 9. And then if you double the cost and add 1, you double 4, add 1, that's 9 as well. So that means it's sort of a well-balanced card, and it's set up like it should be. If, however, you're only getting a 4/4 for 4 mana and there was no text, well, you should feel a little robbed. And if you were getting a 5/5 for 5 mana, that frankly would be the best card there is. It would be, because nothing quite gets that high. So
So
the
there is
thing about
so there's a pretty big gap even when there's only one number difference, you're saying. So because sometimes when I do the vanilla test, if I was thinking like, oh well, it's only one off, that's not a big deal. But here you're saying 1 point off actually is a pretty big deal.
Well, I'll happily take my 4-5 against your 4-4, and we'll see how that goes for us. I mean, it could swing the other way. A 5-4 against a 4-4, it doesn't really, obviously that washes out. But um, I, yeah, I think the vanilla test, you just go with it. It's simple. It's a baseline, and uh, sorry, non-vanilla cards will not live up to vanilla cards or, a pure vanilla card stats. So I think your last guest said cost times 2 was his measure.
Hmm.
And that makes sense to me if you're assuming that they're going to have some extra kick through abilities. But if they don't have that and all they have is the base stats, then you really want to look at the cost times 2 plus 1.
Okay, that makes sense. So when you're comparing, are you looking at like a percentage or a sum? Like for example, like a 2 for 1 mana, is that at the same level on the vanilla test as a 4-5 for 4? Even though you got like 150% of that value on the
Right.
2-1?
I don't look at it that way.
Okay.
But there is sort of a special exception there, and that's that 1 and 2 cost creatures tend to have a little extra kick to them. For example, there are 2-1s for 1 mana or 1-2s for 1 mana, but they have an extra special ability that goes along with it. Same thing for 2 cost creatures. The Knife Juggler, the Mad Bomber. I mean, these are all like 3-2s for 2 mana, but they have an extra ability along with them. That's just because they're so cheap that it's not just 1 or 2 mana you're paying for there. It's 1 and 2 mana and a card, and so you're getting some extra oomph from the card. Whereas when you get into more expensive cards, like the Chillwind Yeti at 4 mana.
Hmm.
The card doesn't really carry quite so much weight in the casting cost because you're paying so much mana at that point.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And then there's an extension of the vanilla test, and there's a lot more of these cards in the game where you get, I call them, they bring a friend with them. So you've got things like the Razorfen Hunter, which is 3 mana, and it's a 2/3, but he brings a 1/1 boar token into play with him. So you add the 2/3 you get for the creature or the minion you summoned, and the 1/1 for the friend he brings along, and that totals 3/4 for 3. And you notice that falls right in line with the vanilla test. And a question I often hear asked is, okay, but is it better to have a single 3/4 or a 2/3 and a 1/1? And I think the general answer, at least what I've come to, and I think what other people have come to, is that it doesn't really matter. It's hard to say. In some situations, one's better, and in other situations, the other one's better. So I personally just consider it a wash, that they're fundamentally equal.
Yeah, I think that's probably true because in situations like, oh, you have a raid leader, okay, then it's better to have both. But if the
Right.
opponent has, a 4/4, then it's probably better to have one or whatever.
Yeah, or certainly you become more vulnerable to AoE.
Yeah.
They can kill the little pieces without losing their guys, whereas if they're all wrapped up in one big package, that it's more likely to kill whatever attacks it. There's reasons on both sides, and I've looked at that over and over again, and I've seen other people look at it, and it just really feels like they balance out.
Okay. Very cool.
Yeah. So moving along, there's what I call direct comparison, which is just taking 2 cards. Like if you've got a
So
card,
this
and you
is
want to know if
so
it's
this is
good.
the second test.
Yeah.
Right.
This
Okay.
is the second test that I would use, is a direct comparison. So if you've got a card and you don't really know if it's good or bad, compare it to something that's as close as possible to it, and preferably that you have an idea of its value, whether you think it's good or not. So one example is that there's a Bloodfen Raptor. This is a vanilla card. It's a 3/2 for 2 mana. And if I want to know if that's good, I'm going to look around for another card to compare it to. So there's a Knife Juggler, which is a 2 mana 3/2, which is the same stats, but it happens to do a point of damage to a random enemy every time you bring a creature into play, which it turns out is pretty strong. So, and the only other difference between the 2 cards is the Bloodfen Raptor happens to be a beast, whereas the Knife Juggler doesn't have a creature type or a minion type. So, what that would seem to say is that the Knife Juggler is better, which I would generally agree with. The beast thing is the only thing the Bloodfen Raptor has going for it, which means in a hunter deck, it carries more weight than it otherwise would. In general, it doesn't necessarily mean that Bloodfin Raptor is bad or that Knife Juggler is just like the best card ever, but it does tell you that Knife Juggler is better than Bloodfin Raptor. And the more you look at these and the more you calibrate, you do sort of get a sense of, okay, well, if this is better than that, and that's better than this other thing, then this other thing has to be horrible. And that first one was the best one.
Okay, interesting. So if you were new to the game and your Bloodfen Raptor showed up in your arena choices, do you essentially look at the Knife Juggler and go, oh, there's better options? Bloodfen Raptor is probably bad? Is that kind of the assumption?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, I think Bloodfen Raptor is a fine card. I am very rarely sorry when I play it on turn 2. But if you're asking for my personal evaluation, I think Bloodfen Raptor is fine to good, and I think Knife Juggler is really good.
Mm-hmm.
But here's a little exercise. So I've got 3 cards here.
Okay.
And we just break them down real quick. So 3 cards are Razorfen Hunter, Harvest Golem, and Imp Master. And to go through those real quick, the Razorfen Hunter is the one we talked about. It's 3. In fact, all of these are 3 mana. So the first one is a 2/3 that brings a 1/1 friend into play. The second one is a 2/3 that when he dies summons a 2/1 to replace him. And then the Imp Master is a 1/5 that at the end of your turn loses 1 health but puts a 1/1 into play.
I think it's a 1/4, isn't it? Or is it a 1/5?
It's a 1/5, but at the end of your turn it'll become a 1/4.
Got it.
And
Okay.
put 1/1 into play.
Okay. So am I choosing here? Am I being tested?
Yeah, I mean just break it down.
So, all right, so let's do the numbers. All right, so it's a 2/3 plus a 1/1. That's a 3/4 for 3. That's good on the vanilla test.
Mhm.
Then the Harvest Golem is a 2/3, and you also get a 2/1. That's a 4/4 for 3, so 1 more attack. That's really good.
Mhm.
And then the Imp Master is like, well, see, this is weird. I'm not sure how to evaluate the Imp Master, right? Do I essentially assume that it will get all of them, so it's kind of like 6 1/1s?
And see, that's the challenge. And when I look at something like that, I say, okay, well, what am I going to get the first turn? And so deterministic, like I put on the board and then I hit end turn, and it certainly won't have been attacked by then. And at the end of my turn, it goes down to a 1/4, but it brings 1/1 in place. So that makes it a 2/5, which is balanced a little differently than a 3/4, but it's still the same total number of power and toughness distributed. So it's a 2/5. Well, I think that compares pretty favorably to a 3/4. In fact, I would call it even. The difference is it arguably gets a little better every turn, because every time it loses 1 of its health, it brings in a new 1/1, so you sort of gain an extra power out of it.
Yeah.
So I would call that sort of equal to a Razorfen Hunter, but it gets a little better for every turn that you manage to keep it alive. And there's a little extra synergy, because if you can like heal it, for example, and keep it alive a few extra turns, it'll just do that much more work for you. And that synergy doesn't really exist with, say, the Razorfen Hunter.
Yeah. Okay, I see that. Yeah, I definitely agree. Better than Razorfen Hunter in a vacuum comparing these. The thing I like about the Harvest Golem is that it doesn't have the AoE downside that a lot of these have, where it has the friend, because when one dies, then the next one comes, so it can't get hit by the same AoE.
Exactly. And I would consider the fact that his sort of friend, or actually it's his replacement in his case, only comes along once he dies. That's, I think, intended to be a slight downside, and overall is a slight downside, because you don't have as much force on the board, but it does add survivability and sort of insurance. Like, yeah, go ahead and kill it, and I'm still going to get somebody in its place.
Yeah.
So the way I look at, and another way of looking at it is, if he never dies, then you never got any value from the 2/1, and you only paid, or you paid 3 mana for only a 2/3, which is actually not a good investment.
Yeah.
So he does run a little bit of risk, but if he does die and you do get that the damage spell on the 2/1 out of him, then he did, I think, turn out to be profitable relative to the Razorfen Hunter.
Okay. So if I had to pick, I would probably pick Harvest Golem, unless I knew I had something like the Raid Leader or something. Would you go for Imp Master?
I don't know. They're pretty close, and when I break it down, I think assuming the Harvest Golem dies over the course of the game, and if the Imp Master lives for 1 turn, so that you got 2 1/1s out of him, that would actually break even with the same number of power and toughness. So I would sort of think about, well, do I expect the Imp Master to live 2 extra turns after I bring him out? Because if so, I think the Imp Master is just from a numbers game, the better bet. Otherwise, I think the Harvest Golem is probably the better bet.
Okay. Interesting. Very
And
cool.
I would
Yeah.
call Razor Fen Hunter the most reliable, because you're going to get your 2 creatures that total to 3/4 for 3. You're going to get those immediately no matter what.
Yeah.
Where the others are a little more conditional to get their full value.
Yeah.
And this is the way a lot of these card evaluations are going to go. And this goes to your question. I think a lot of these have upsides and downsides, and you just need to look at, well, what are your expectations and how do you play, and what have you noticed around how long these things can survive?
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know, this may be a test later on, but a lot of stuff with things like this, I always think back to, what do I get most discouraged by or upset by when my opponent plays them? And like when the opponent throws down the Imp Master, I'm rarely scared. When they throw down Razor Fen Hunter, I'm kind of like, oh, you had to draft that.
Yeah.
And then, but when Harvest Golem drops, I'm always like, oh man, I got to dedicate 2 cards. I got to figure out how to deal with this. So that's always like kind of my backup plan on stuff like this.
Yeah. That's legit.
All right, teach me more.
All right.
Teacher Scott.
So the next test is, call it just comparing stats and keywords. So the idea here is we've talked about simple creatures and the simple ability of summoning a friend, but let's try to talk about some of the common things you'll find on cards, like buffing another creature or having stealth or taunt or those sort of things here. I think I did this just the tiniest bit on the last episode I was on, where I went into how much value a card is. Like when you play a spell or a creature that tells you to draw a card, how much is that worth? And I think I kind of said like 2.5 mana is roughly where it nets out. So this is my attempt to do that for a variety of common things that you run across.
Oh, wow.
And I just want to preface this by saying, this is not locked in stone. Most of this actually, in prepping for this episode, I went through and, like, if I want to know how much stealth cost, I looked at stealth creatures and I compared them to vanilla creatures, and I looked like, this really is how much Blizzard is charging you for stealth attached to a creature. And it's not to say that it's a good or bad value at that cost. It's just really an acknowledgement of, this is how much Blizzard is sort of charging you to tack this onto a card. So you have to think about is, well, I'll just spoil stealth. Stealth is half a mana. So if stealth is worth half a mana to you, then by all means migrate towards stealth cards, because if you think it's worth more than that, then you're getting a bargain by choosing those stealth cards. So just to run through this list pretty quickly, stealth is worth half a mana. Taunt tends to be worth half a mana. A creature that puts +1/+1 on another creature, like what's that? Shattered Sun Cleric.
Mm-hmm.
That's a 3/2 for 3 that puts +1/+1 on a friendly creature. That costs a mana. It's pretty much the same as having +1/+1 on yourself. Divine Shield. This one was a little fuzzier, but it tends to be around 1.5 mana. Spell damage +1 tends to be about half a mana. As mentioned before, drawing a card tends to be between 2 and 2.5 mana, but there's some cards where it's a lot cheaper, to be honest. And there's some cards that can sort of go off multiple times if they're lucky. And in those, depending on how many activations you get, it really plays with the price and can make it cheaper. So that's kind of on the high end. But there are some cards that and I'll go into this later, that some people think are good, that are actually really overcosted when you break down how much you're paying for things like card draw, but we'll get into that later. A point of direct damage is another variable one. They tend to charge between 1 and 2 mana for that. So, Fire Elemental is a good example of a shaman card that you and I talked about last time I was on, that is very, very efficient for tacking on targeted damage at a very cheap cost. But that's kind of a special class specific shaman card. And most cards, you're paying a lot more for that. And then the charge ability, that one varies a lot. I looked, and it's just they're charging wildly different amounts depending on the creature. And the general sense was the more attack power it has, the more mana it costs to have it get charged. Because I think they don't want you coming out of the gate with some big 20 toughness creature and just killing your opponent. They really make you pay a lot for it.
That kind of makes sense, because it kind of scales like the direct damage, right? Because it's 1 point per direct damage. So if you're getting more damage, they charge you more for it.
Yeah, yeah, actually, it's a pretty good analogy. I personally, I actually think of stealth as kind of a poor man's charge,
Hmm.
because in both cases you get to attack with the creature before they can do anything to it. It's just with
Usually,
charge.
because there's AoE and stuff like that.
That's true. Yeah. And random targeting cards and
Hmm.
all that can matter. And they can also see your stealth card and bring out, say, a taunt creature to foil it. So, but that's why stealth tends to be a better deal
Yeah.
than charge.
Now you mentioned with the shaman how the shaman have the fire elemental that gets that great deal on direct damage. Is there sort of the thought that like are rogue cards undercosted on stealth and paladins are undercosted on divine shield and stuff, or is it all even in class cards pretty similar?
That is skipping ahead.
Oh,
But
okay.
yeah, I mean the spoiler alert, the class specific cards do often tend to be better. And I think I've got some examples of that down below that we'll get to. Yeah, I
Okay.
do. But yes, and so um, you'll notice that like shaman cards tend to hand out things like Wind Fury pretty generously.
Hmm.
They have a lot of take advantage of overload, although it's not necessarily a positive. Um, you've got priest cards that tend to have cost efficient healing. So yeah, they do tend to be cheaper at what they're good at.
Okay. Cool.
All right,
So
so here's
yeah,
a practice card selection if you're cool
yeah.
with that.
I got the handy dandy list here, so I can try and add up their values.
All right, so the first one is Shattered Sun Cleric, which is a 3 cost, 3/2 minion that gives +1/+1 to any target friendly minion.
Okay.
The next one is Flesh Eating Ghoul, which is let's see, let me click through on this. It's a 3 cost, 2/3 that whenever a minion dies, doesn't matter if it's yours or your opponent's, you get +1 attack on that guy. And the last one is Thrallmar Farseer, which is a 2/3 for 3 with Wind Fury. And I purposefully picked one where I didn't go over the value of Wind Fury, but I thought it'd be a fun thought exercise.
Yeah. Okay. So all right, let's do the ones I know. Shattered Sun Cleric. That's a 1 mana cost you put on that price. So essentially, so I would be getting a 3/2 for 2,
Yeah.
which honestly is a little unexciting, right? Because that's the
Well, it's
Bloodfin Raptor.
yeah, I'd look at it more like a 3/4 for 3 because you're kind of getting the combined. I mean, yes, you're right, but look at sort of the combined power toughness of it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So 3/4 for 3. All right. Which is a good card. Um, I don't I don't know. I don't know though, dude, because it's still a 2 health. It's not a 4 health. That's a huge change, right? Because
And yeah, and there's a little risk because what if you don't have any friendly minions out?
yeah, sometimes you just have to drop it.
Yep.
All right, so I'm a little less excited about that card. Flesh Eating Ghoul. This is so the way I would evaluate it, and correct me if you would do it a different way or help me see. I would do it. I would only count the attack that I knew I could make happen the turn I played it.
Mm-hmm.
So I would evaluate it. Usually you can trade a minion most of the time when you play this guy. So I would say I could get a 4/3 for 3. That's how I would evaluate him. And then, kind of there's some upside there as well, but he's probably not going to live longer um, than that. So 4/3 for 3 is really good.
But so I want to point out
Yeah.
that that's an if as well, because if you don't have any creatures that can attack, and for that matter, if you don't have any creatures that you want to attack to sort of have two things die,
Yeah.
then you're in the same position over the Shattered Sun Cleric where it is conditional.
That's true. At
In fact,
least,
I think the
yeah.
Flesh Eating Ghoul is more conditional than the Shattered Sun Cleric.
It is more conditional, but the thing to me is Shadow Sun Cleric, you will have to play, and its battle cry effect is gone. Once
Yep.
it's played, you have no chance of getting that value. But Flesh Eating Ghoul, you throw it down, you get value because if they don't kill it, you could have minions die in the future. And so
Yep.
that value can always come. You're never throwing it away until they kill it.
Hey, back with the threat of activation again. Remember that?
Yeah, yeah, and just when you throw that down, they have to think, right? The opponent has to think, oh, he has something, right? He's gonna have a trick to power that next turn. I better do something about it. And that's actually the threat of activation, man. You want to talk about that? Let's talk about Thrallmar Farseer. This guy, anything with Wind Fury has huge threat of activation when it lands on the board.
Mm-hmm.
because they take a simple, +3 attack buff and turn it into deal 6 damage to your face,
Yep.
which is scary. So he's a 2/3 for 3 with Wind Fury, which, man, that does seem expensive. But I mean, I don't know. Compared to the Shadowed Sun Cleric, I mean, it's the same stats essentially. And actually, I like 2/3 more than I like 3/2.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm more of a defensive player, a more control player, so that might be part of it. And Wind Fury, I don't know. I've never been excited about this card, but now that you got me comparing these directly, I really like it compared to stuff like the Shadowed Sun Cleric. I still like Flesh Eating Ghoul because Flesh Eating Ghoul has that infinite potential, right? It's not
Mm-hmm.
gonna happen, but sometimes sometimes it's gonna deal a lot. Like if you have this in an AoE late game, I mean, you can make this do some crazy stuff.
I had a guy I was playing tonight, and he got his Flesh and Ghoul up to 11-3.
Yeah. Oh man, those are the moments. So if I had to pick, I would pick. Obviously, it depends on the class. I would probably pick Flesh Eating Ghoul, and then I don't know. You convince me. You convince me by not saying anything. I convince myself, and then I'd pick Thrallmar, Farseer, and I'd pick Shadow Sun Cleric last. Does that make me dumb?
Well, no, I don't think it makes you dumb. I think my pick would probably be Shattered Sun Cleric first, because that +1/+1 kind of has a charge element to it. You get to use that +1/+1 the turn it comes out to really screw with your opponent's combat math.
Yeah.
So I see that as being well worth the risk of not having anybody to put it on, because it can always hold it for another turn or play 2 creatures on the same turn because it's cheap enough to usually get that out of it. Flesh Eating Ghoul, I found to be a little too conditional. I mean, it's fine. It's not bad. To me, it's just the tiniest hair less reliable and less valuable than the Shattered Sun Cleric by my own estimation, my own style.
Yeah.
And then Thrallmar Farseer, I just have such a hard time with it because usually you play it and before it can ever attack, it gets beat down. And if they attack it, well, it was only a 2/3. It was never anything more than a 2/3 if you never had a turn to attack with it. And in my experience, it does kind of have that like taunt, hit me sign on it. And that kind of maybe changes your opponent's game plan from what they would have otherwise done. But I just never get my money's worth out of the Thrallmar Farseer.
Yeah.
But a lot of that was based on experience, not evaluation too.
Yeah. Then Scott, I gotta admit, I'm caught up on the Shadow Sun Cleric, because if its Battle Cry is worth 1 mana, it's a 3/2 for 2 mana essentially with an extra perk on there, and that just doesn't seem good to me.
Yeah, and maybe the problem was that with talking about how much those different abilities cost. I mean, I think the problem there is saying that it's a 2/3 for or 3/2 for 2, because yeah, it's hard. I don't know. You may be right. Like I said, this is all subjective, fuzzy stuff.
Yeah.
I just, you're making something else that was small, bigger in its place. And I found that I usually try and leave my defenses in a state where everything's going to live with just like 1 hit point,
Yeah.
And so if they can come along and mess up that combat math, that gets pretty painful.
Yeah. So maybe the answer to this then is that Blizzard is undercharging for this because it's worth more than 1 mana. So essentially. Let's say this is maybe too far, but let's say it's worth 2 mana, we think, because then essentially it's a 3/2 for 1, and that's incredible. So maybe that's what it is. They're only charging you 1 mana, but maybe value wise we think it's worth more than 1 mana.
Yeah, and when I went through those numbers too, by the way, those were just approximate. I mean, this is all hand-wavy, fuzzy stuff, but I mean, you'll notice when you compare things that they're, especially in the simpler cases, there are differences, but it doesn't mean that that's, again, what it should cost. Things could be underpowered. I think experience is going to inform a lot of this as well, and that's not a section I have, but
yeah, man, I'm super interested in this because now I'm thinking like Argent Squire, the 1/1 for 1 mana, which is a very popular card, and here you have Divine Shield is usually costing on your cards about 1.5 mana. I mean, that's a great deal then. And that card is obviously very popular, so that kind of helps, explain why.
Yeah, I used to think that card was not very good, and I saw a bunch of people use it to really good effect, and then I threw it in a couple of decks that had some interesting synergies I could use with it, and I have to say, it's a lot better than it seems like it would be.
Yeah. So actually, I have a question real fast. I'm jumping back to the vanilla test, sort of, because
Sure.
I just ran across the shield bearer. How much does a 0 attack hurt the vanilla test, or does it hurt the vanilla test at all?
Yeah, I don't know that I mean, I don't have any special rules around that. I will say zero one, and this does jump down to another concept. I think I've got it in here. Let me see. Nah, I think I took it out. Um, but it was the idea that pure healing, pure player damage, or pure protection cards, I think are often overrated. I think they're often not as good as they appear to be, and so I would put it in the same that card in the same camp as something like 1 mana gain, your hero gains 4 life or something like that, because it's not really helping your board state. It's not helping you win. It's just helping you lose more slowly. And yes, there are exceptions to that. Like you have creatures that you want to live a turn, so you put that in front of it, and that's that can soak up maybe a couple attacks if you're lucky, and that may be enough for another card to get a huge amount of value. But the important thing there is that you're relying on other cards to do your work. The 0/4 itself is not really helping you. It's just maybe helping another card shine. So I actually think of 0 power minions as not really being minions at all, but almost like spells of some sort.
Okay, so even though
Um,
that guy would be kind of off the charts on the vanilla test, because he is that extreme, it's just not really worth it.
yeah, in most decks, I do not play him. Now, if I was running a lot of creatures of cards that, things like Cult Master or um, Imp Master for that matter. I mean, things that kind of do things for you each turn, or
Yeah.
maybe cards with a lot of really high power and really low toughness that you just need to keep alive. That may be a place where he could shine.
Okay. Now, since we're on this card text and keywords and stuff, where does how do you calculate in rage effects? Do you basically have to figure it out based on like the likelihood that you will enrage it without killing it? Is that the idea?
I would say that certainly factors in, and that's why Angry Chicken is almost jokingly the worst card,
Yeah.
because it's essentially a wisp that you can get for free, which is already not a great card, except the ability that it comes with, that you're paying that 1 extra mana for relative to the wisp, is an ability you cannot use unless you somehow buff it with another card. And why would you buff a 1/1 creature?
Yeah.
It's big enough to where it can reliably take damage and still live. So I think that just goes to show that to answer your question, yes, it depends in part on the survivability. Like if I've got weapon cards, the Spiteful Smith, which is
Hmm.
a 5 cost 4/6, which is good by itself on the vanilla test. It's just a hair shy, but it gives you what, +2 weapon power when
Yep.
it's enraged. Well, hey, if you're playing a deck with a lot of weapons, that thing is likely to be enraged a lot of the time because it's got such high toughness.
Hmm. Okay.
So, so yeah, I think that factors in.
Cool. All right. Teach me another thing.
All right. So we talked about kind of the keywords, but then what do you do when you're trying to compare freeform abilities? A lot of the cards just have what I describe as freeform text on them that describe some effect that's generally unique to that card. And those abilities almost always comes at a cost, and sometimes it'll be the opposite, where it's actually the text describes something bad and you get better stats for the cost. So an example of that is the Ancient Watcher, which is a 2 cost 4/5, which sounds fantastic until you notice that it says on the card can't attack. And it turns out that if a minion can't attack, it can't actually do anything by itself, because that's the only thing minions do by default is attack. So, but normally you're going to find that the stats are a little lower than the casting cost should have them at, but they come with some ability. So maybe they do, a point of damage or something as they come into play. Maybe they're applying +1/+1. Maybe they're growing or making other things grow. Maybe they have a conditional effect, and it's I don't even want to try and go through the whole wide swath of abilities. I just want to point out that's where a lot of your thought should go. It does help to look for similar effects on other cards, and a lot of these you can get a feeling. So when we were talking about the Flesh Eating Ghoul,
Hmm.
uh, one way that I look at that is, okay, so it's a 2/3 for 3. If it were a 4/3 for 3, that would be sort of solid on the vanilla test. So what that says is I need 2 activations to break even. Less than that, and I've overspent for that card. And if I get more out of that, then I've underspent for that card, gotten a better card than I would have otherwise from my mana.
Mm-hmm.
So it tells me that if I'm going to play the Flesh Eating Ghoul, I really need it to proc twice, or I really shouldn't be using it or playing it. And that kind of goes to what you said, where you would tend to only play it if you know that it can trigger twice. And that's, I think, a great way to go about that. So some cards, like the Frostwolf Warlord is another example. That is a 5-cost 4/4 that gets +1/+1 as a battlecry effect for every other minion in play when it comes into play. So you need 1.5 activations of that for it to break even and be there. So obviously you can't get 1.5 activations, but it means if there's one other creature in play when it comes out, you've overpaid, but not by much. But if there's 2 or more creatures, then you've gotten a better deal than even a vanilla creature would have been. And a vanilla creature is spending all of its cost on making the biggest stats possible.
Yeah.
So that is, I found a lot of these cards you can sort of quantify, like if they give little bonuses to stats, you can say, well, how many of those would it take to match a vanilla creature?
Yeah.
So let's, you ready for another example choice?
Yeah.
Okay. So the first one here is a Priestess of Elune, which is sorry, I'm a little behind on my clicking.
There's a 2/1 for 1, if I remember.
No, this is the 6 mana.
I'm sorry. I was thinking
6
Young Priestess.
Yeah. So this is the 6 mana 5/4, and its battle cry is restore 4 health to your hero.
Okay.
All right. So any thoughts about that as we go?
I'm not super big on that. Like even against the heaviest aggro decks, that's fine, but that's a weak health pool and attack for that cost.
Yeah. And then the next one we've got is Frost Elemental. So these are all 6 costs, by the way. A lot of these examples I gave have the same casting cost to make it easier to compare the other stuff about them. So in this case, it's a 6 mana cost, 5/5, so slightly better on stats. Battlecry freeze a creature.
I like that. It's you are paying 3 total stats for that freeze. But freeze can be so good, especially late game by the time this guy's coming out.
Yep. And then let's throw the last one out.
Yeah.
And by the way, this one was, I was kind of sneaky with it. I was trying to, with this whole example, prove how hard it is to compare in a way. And just to show that it is a subjective exercise comparing these, because how much is a blizzard effect or freeze effect worth, for example?
Trying to stump me over here.
So the last one is a legendary. Hogger, so is 6 mana for a 4/4, so the lowest stats of any we've seen. At the end of your turn, summon a 2/2 Null with Taunt.
Okay, so he's essential. So from our vanilla test, he's a 6/6. He comes out as a 6/6 with with probably the best kind of taunt. He creates taunt that protects himself, and then also gets bigger every turn. So that seems incredibly strong.
Now, if he dies on the first turn, I would say you've probably overpaid for him, because you only got a 6/6 for 6 if he dies the first turn. Although you did get taunt with it, which is worth.
Yeah, you got a 6/6, and they had to spend 2 attacks to quote unquote kill him, essentially, because they had to kill both of them.
Yep.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. Yeah. So all right. So let me go through. And it's kind of hard, right? Because we've said it definitely depends on the type of deck you're running, right? Because if I'm struggling against aggro decks, I'm probably going to value Priestess of Elune, because that 4 health can be useful. But man, I can't get on board with Priestess of Elune. So I'm putting her at the bottom of the barrel right now. 4 health is just so vulnerable, and 4 health to yourself. Like if you could restore 4 health and get to choose where it goes, I'd be on board. But to your hero, no. Freeze, I don't know. Like you said, it is really hard, right? Freeze and the taunt minion could essentially kind of serve the same purpose in certain board states. Yeah, to me, Priestess of Elune and Frost Elemental come out, and their impact is done, right? But Hogger has that potential that his his impact can keep growing every single turn unless they deal with him right away. So I really like that. His text isn't just one and done. His text is kill me now or else you're going to be in big trouble.
Yep.
So that's what I think. So I take Hogger, then Frost Elemental, then Priestess of Elune.
Yeah, and that's the same order I'd pick them in. That Priestess of Elune just has that pure hero healing ability. I'd much rather have I think there's like a dark scale healer.
Yeah, the 2 to everyone.
Yeah, and if that's doing 2 to your hero, well, compared to the 4, like that's close. And 2 to everything else you've got, and it turns out that you're paying less of a mana premium for that effect than just hitting your own hero for 4. So yeah, that's the Priestess of Elune. I see a lot of people using it and feeling like it gives them a lot of survivability. Also, if you happen to be at full hit points already, it actually just that ability you paid for just doesn't do anything.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and in the Frost Elemental, if your opponent doesn't have a creature, it whiffs, but normally they do, and you can always freeze the hero as well. It only matters for weapon classes, but you can sometimes prevent a weapon attack if you freeze
that's
the
true.
hero.
Yeah.
Yeah. And 5/5 is, I think, a respectable body to leave down. And I think in aggro decks, Frost Elemental tends to work pretty well because it'll let your big stuff survive to attack just one more turn. And when you're starting to get, to big enough bodies like this on the board, that one turn can make all the difference.
Yeah.
And in Hogger, it's just ridiculous. When you add, 2/2 plus taunt to his sort of total size every turn, holy cow. And like you said, he helps himself survive by creating little guys to defend him. If you've got 1 or 2 other attractive targets on the board, they just suddenly have to choose from a list of bad options. And he's a legendary, so it shouldn't be too surprising. I kind of cheated. He was the first legendary I crafted.
Oh, really? Nice.
Because he's that good. So compared to all, and he's affordable too, which is a concept we'll talk about a little later, because that really does matter.
Yeah.
I
I got a sudden quiz for you, buddy.
Yeah.
All right. So walk me through the thought process on Young Priestess. So she's a 2/1 for 1, which is good.
Mm-hmm.
And then her text is, at the end of your turn, give another random friendly minion +1 health. Do you kind of try and do like the vanilla test for that and say like, oh, well, she's essentially a 2/2 for 1 because she's giving health? Or how do you try and value that?
I like those, the things that give like stats every turn or stats when they come into play or under certain conditions. Those to me are some of the easiest cards to evaluate relative to other cards, because you can take a vanilla card and you can say, well, how many points of power and toughness do I need to sprinkle around in order to catch this thing up to a vanilla creature? And especially if it's something on a trigger or that, can happen at variable amounts, then I have to ask myself, well, what are the likelihood that it's going to be more or less than the break-even point? And if it tends to be higher than the break-even point, then that's a card that I'll tend to prefer over, say, a vanilla counterpart. So that one, and I don't have it up here, but you said it was a 2/1 for 1?
Yeah.
Yeah, that one's kind of a special case where anything with 1 power makes me cringe a little bit, because if you're playing a rogue or mage deck, they don't even have to spend a card to kill it. They just have to spend a couple mana.
Yeah.
That said, a lot of times a card like that works pretty well late game because there's so many things that they want to cast and spend their mana on, and there's a lot of potential targets that it does kind of get lost in the noise. And plus on turn 1, that unless you use the coin to bring out another 1 cost creature, it's not actually going to apply that +1 health to anything. So that ties into a concept I'll talk about later, I think, of is the card on curve or not? And the fact is, I rarely want to play Young Priestess on turn 1, but otherwise I think it's pretty good, because if I can have it activate once and I sort of get 2/2 from my 1 mana, yeah, that's good. And all I have to do to make that happen is drop it later in the game.
Yeah. Do you penalize it all because it's random, or do you essentially just kind of like, well, it'll probably be good no matter where it lands?
Yeah, that's probably where I net out. You can shape the randomness, which I know sounds weird, but people do it all the time with these random effects. Like if you've got the Knife Juggler in play, you're trying to get things down to 1 hit points, or you're using other guys to kill the targets that you don't want him to hit to minimize the number of potential targets. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to say. I mean, generally, if you can choose where, say, a +1/+1 goes, like with the Shattered Sun Cleric, that is better than if it said, give +1/+1 to a random creature you control. And that's, I think, part of what makes that Shattered Sun Cleric so strong, is that you get to apply it to exactly the place where it's going to do the most good.
Yeah.
And you don't always get that benefit with other things.
Okay. All right. One more question for you, then I'll let you move on. What about silence? Because that's a fairly kind of standard thing.
Yeah.
We didn't cover that. How do you value that?
Yeah, that's a good call. I should have done some research on that. I don't know what kind of mana it converts to. I've found that
So just for comparison, the Ironbeak Owl is a
Yeah.
2/1 for 2 that silences. And then what's the forecasting one?
Yeah, it's a 4/3.
4/3 for 4, right? Yeah, 4/3 for 4 that silences. So it looks like it's charging essentially 1 mana. Is that
About a
right?
mana, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, because in the owl's case, it's a beast as well, so it would compare directly to the Bloodfen Raptor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so there you have it. Silence costs 1 mana, and it's awkward because in some matches that silence just sits in your hand and it doesn't really have any benefit. And sometimes, man, you just knock down some big creature that, is super buffed up, or they give taunt to. I'm always clearing taunt off of minions just to go in for the kill when they didn't expect it.
Yeah.
So it's hit or miss. And a lot of times what you'll find is the riskier a card is, the more value they tend to give it to compensate for the fact that it's not reliable.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Cool. All right. So next section. This is you asked about the class specific cards, and this is just looking at class specific cards versus neutral. And the class cards do tend to be a little better, sometimes a lot better. And I think the design reason behind this is that if all of the class cards were, say, worse than the best neutral minions, then nobody would play the class specific cards. They would just play the best neutral minions for the most part. So I think, when you're a priest, they really want you to have that feel of healing things and protection. So they made their signature cards, things like the I'm forgetting the name, the Northshire Cleric, the 1/3 for 1, which is already very good. To let you draw a card every time you heal a minion. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Crazy. There's the Cruel Taskmaster of the Warrior. It's a 2 mana cost 2/2 that does appointed damage to whatever you want, and that thing gains 2 attack, which generally is really good to do your own creatures. Synergizes very well with Enrage. There's the Frothing Berserker it synergizes very well with. But I mean, that's just a super strong card, and it's, I think, again, meant to be like a standout warrior card. And the Hunter's the same way. Like Unleash the Hounds was a great example, but there's still others. What's the 4/3 that gives +2/+2 to a beast you have in play?
Oh yeah, that?
Cruel, no,
it's the, wait for it. Oh, hold on, I'm in crafting mode. There you go. Houndmaster,
right?
Yeah.
So I mean, if you're playing a hunter deck, and I would sure hope you can find some beasts laying around to buff with that thing.
Yeah, because that's on the vanilla test, that's a 6/5 for 4. That's incredible.
Exactly.
And taunt.
And I think, part of that is that it's a little more restrictive. It's not like the Shattered Sun Cleric where you have to have another creature. It does have to be a beast. So it's a little more limiting, and you might have cases, and it happens where you have to play him and you just don't have anything to target. So you've got a 4/3. Congratulations. But man, when he catches big, and most of the time he catches. So, it's sort of the break-even point for him would be if 50% of the time he caught, he would still break even in the long run. Mm-hmm. But I think he catches way more than 50%. So I tend to play as many of him as I can get.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, that's and I've got a couple other examples here. Let's see. So Goldshire Footman is a 1/2 taunt for 1. And some, he's not great. Some people play him. He's the trump to some of the other super, super cheap cards. But just as a comparison, the Warlocks have a Voidwalker, which is a 1 cost 1/3 with taunt. So he gets a free extra point of toughness just for being a Warlock card. And he's a demon, which isn't worth a whole lot by itself, but there's some Warlock cards that synergize with demons. So I think it's only an upside. I'm not aware of any downsides to being a demon.
Yeah, there are no downsides.
Yeah. So, and another example is the Boulder Fist Ogre, which you talked about in your last show, rightfully so, is a 6/7 for 6. It's a tremendous card. But the priests have a 6/6 for 6, which is the Temple Enforcer. So yeah, it's one less toughness, but it gives, or one less health, but it gives another minion plus 3 health. Well, so if you add that together, that's a 6/9.
Yeah.
And I have found the Temple Enforcer to just be a rock solid bomb. It can change combat math. I mean, you're going to add it to the thing that's most advantageous to add it to. You can put on a Cult Master to keep it alive. You can put it on an Imp Master to keep it alive. You can put on your Taunt guy to just block the opposing turn. You know, it's just, there's so much you can do.
Oh
with
man, yeah. I mean, and stuff. There's so much stuff in Priest that synergizes with it. Like you put it on the Light Spawn, which turns that health into attack as well.
Right. Yep. So that said, there are bad class specific cards too, but keep that in mind when you're evaluating them. Is if you find that a class specific card is looking less attractive than a neutral, especially if it's a minion, I take a second look at it and make extra sure, because there's a chance you're missing something, because they oftentimes get a lot of extra oomph kind of for free. All right, so the next section is on randomness, and we're getting to the point where we've touched on a lot of these concepts earlier on. The thing with randomness is it is inherently a risk. There's generally no upside to risk, so the card needs to compensate you. If it's going to say, well, I could be, I could be X, like a Chillwind Yeti or something for 4/5. But if I'm going to take part of that power and toughness away for the cost and instead put it in ability, if that ability is cloaked in randomness, then it's got to be better than it would otherwise be. Like I was talking before, being able to target something with a Shattered Sun Cleric is a heck of a lot better than it, say, hitting a random friendly minion, which is a lot better than it being a random minion at all, right?
Looking at you, Mad Bomber.
Yeah, so Mad Bomber is a very interesting case. And in fact, that's one I had called out here. And there are different types of randomness. There's things that target only things you want it to, like only enemies or only you or whichever's in your best interest. There's randomness where it can happen with anything. There's a warrior card called Brawl, which basically, I forget how it's worded, but all the creatures die except one random creature. And the animation's awesome for it, by the way, if you haven't seen it.
Oh yeah.
All the little guys jump in the middle. There's like a cartoon cloud while they beat each other up, and then one emerges victorious after throwing all the others out of it. It's great. But that's an example of just total randomness. But it also illustrates that a lot of times you can shape that randomness. I had an opponent play that card on me, and I had the edge, and he used it to basically, I think he probably held off on playing minions for a couple of turns and instead was investing in like shields and getting some of his spells out of his hand while I built up minions. I thought, what's he doing? I'm going to win for sure. And then he played Brawl. Well, the randomness in that case, it was going to be one of his creatures survive, but he managed to turn that in his favor to where it really read sort of kill all your opponent's creatures but one.
Yeah.
And he didn't have to sacrifice any of his own creatures to do it. Likewise, the Mad Bomber, if you bring that out, certainly you generally want to cast that before you cast other minions on your turn, because you want to increase the chance it's going to hit their side so that they have more things relative to how many you have. If you bring out guys before you cast Mad Bomber, you're just increasing the chance that Mad Bomber is going to randomly target him instead of one of your opponent's guys. The only time, and another concept around randomness is if you can manage to take, well, any fault, but especially randomness, and somehow turn that to your benefit, that's great. So Mad Bomber suddenly makes a lot more sense to play if you're playing enraged creatures, or if you're playing the what's the 1/3 who lets you draw a card every time he takes a point of damage?
Acolyte of Pain.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and that's not exactly a concept about randomness. It's more a concept around just like, anytime you see a weakness of a card, if you can somehow manage to turn that into a benefit, fantastic. And Mad Bomber is a good example of that. But and another example of randomness is Deadly Shot. That's a hunter card. It's a spell that just destroys a random enemy minion. Normally, it's not very good if they're bringing out a lot of small stuff. But the way that you use that card is you shape that randomness. So you spend the majority of your turn before you cast it setting up the board to have as few enemies as possible and leaving only the big ones. In a perfect world, you kill everything except that 8/8 that he just dropped or something. And then you're killing, a super big creature with just a small amount of mana.
Yeah, this is probably the most random card that I see used most effectively. Like a lot of times, I mean, you can get Chillwind Yetis with it. This is the one, because I'm very random averse. You talked about how at the top of the show how a lot of this will depend on your play style and stuff. I just really don't like random cards. So unless it's really overvalued, I'm just not interested. because it's just so frustrating for me as a player. But Deadly Shot is one of the few cards that I can get behind where it's like, okay, this is going to be easy to shape the randomness.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think about multi-shot? Talk about multi-shot.
I love multi-shot. I run it in all of my hunter decks essentially. Multi-shot is a 4-cost, deal 3 damage to 2 random enemy minions. I think it's really easy to shape the randomness around this one because you don't have to get them down to 1 minion. You have to get them down to 2 minions, which is a lot easier.
Yep.
3 damage is a really nice number. There's a lot of 3 health minions out there, especially around the time on their turn 2 and turn 3 and even turn 4 that they'll be playing. That'll help finish off. I really like multi-shot.
Exactly. Yeah, me too. And I think it's a very efficient card. It does have not only the downside of randomness, but it does also have the downside of conditions. They need 2 creatures in play for you to target it. And I've had many games where I'm sitting with it in my hand. I'm like, cast another minion so I can kill it. But yeah, I mean, I think in exchange for those trade-offs, you get what is otherwise a great card. And even though it does target minions at random, because it hits 2, you're so much more likely to hit the thing that you want to hit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or to just get, construct that case where it hits both things in play. Yeah. Okay. So next concept is card advantage. Now drawing cards is good, right? If you could just draw a free card, of course you would do it. I have a note here, though, that the drawing cards is good in moderation. And the reason I say in moderation is that typically when you're drawing a card, attached to another card, you are overpaying. Well, not overpaying. You're certainly paying for it. And it's not coming on the board as power and toughness. And I talked about this in the last episode I was on, but it's the opposite of tempo. You're sort of investing in the long term at the cost of the short term. So you have to be very careful about that. And if every card in your deck were, had a draw card on it, like if you could have a deck of novice engineers or, any of those kind of cards, what you find is that you're overpaying for everything and you're getting so many cards in your hand, but you're not actually ever able to take advantage of it. So that's the logical extreme. You're never going to have every card in your deck drawing you an extra card. But if you go through that thought exercise, you realize like, hey, wait a minute, that deck isn't very good. So, I can't tell you where that break-even point is. Like you must have 4 draw cards in your deck to break even. I have no idea where it stops becoming worth it. But oddly, as time has gone on, I've become more and more careful about draw cards and valuing a lot of them less and less. So I've got a little, here's another arena choice for you to go through. And, I'd like to hear your thoughts on each of these cards, and I can give you mine. So let's see. The first one is Arcane Intellect, which is a mage spell, and it's 3 mana, draw a card.
Draw 2 cards.
Oh, I'm sorry. Draw 2 cards. Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it's fine. It's one of those things where it feels like you're stalling, right? And in Hearthstone, it's such a fast-paced game, especially now with so many aggro decks. You really can't afford to spend your turn 3 doing nothing because they're developing their board and just punching your face. I'm not a huge fan.
Yeah. Okay, next. Azure Drake. So it's a 5-cost, 4/4, spell power +1, and draw a card.
I love this guy. I would play him in almost any deck. I think we actually maybe talked about him last week.
Yeah. Yeah, you did.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of him. So going by the test that we learned, and maybe I'm learning stuff today. Let's see. So the test, he's way under on the vanilla scale. He's 3 points behind on toughness on stats, but spell damage is pretty good, although I rarely get a lot of value out of the spell damage. And then draw a card obviously is great. I really like him.
Yeah. And so if you consider the draw card, let's just say it's worth 2 mana, which is I think on the lower side of the window. Mm-hmm. That sort of makes him a 6/6 for his cost. And if you add another 1 point for the spell damage, that kind of makes him like say a 6/7.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. For 5 mana, which is like, oh. So especially if you're in a position to use that spell power, that is an extremely efficient card.
Yeah.
And I get the sense like he's been becoming much more popular in both constructed and arena, and rightfully so. I think he's one of the better cards in the set,
Yeah.
even if you're in no position to use spell power.
Yeah, just on his own. Yeah, especially if you don't have card advantage or don't have card draw before this, turn 5, turn 6, this is when your hand's starting to get small. And this is right when you start getting more cards back in. I like that.
Yeah. And then the last one is Novice Engineer, which is a 1/1 for 2 mana and Battlecry draw card.
So I don't know if I should. I think I like this card more than Arcane Intellect just because it has a body. And because one attack is fairly relevant in the high aggro meta that we have now, it is a threat that they have to take care of because it'll take out a lot of decent aggro minions. Yeah, I'm really wary against cards that are just draw without a body attached to it. And once you throw a body attached to it, I get on board real quick.
Yeah, that's fair. And so to break these down a little bit by my scale, Arcane Intellect, one way of looking at it is that you spend 3 mana and a card to draw 2 cards. So one of those cards just replaces it. It's as if it had been that other card all along.
Yeah.
So you're actually paying 3 mana for 1 card and nothing else, which it turns out is the single most expensive draw card ability that I know of on any card in the game. It's actually tied with Thought Steal from the Priest.
Oh, interesting. Wow. Okay.
So
that makes sense. Yeah, because you're only gaining 1 card. You're cycling a little bit, which has a small value when you're replacing the other card.
Well, only if having 29 cards is sort of better than having 30, which in constructed makes sense because you're going to pick the first card you put in your deck is typically going to be the best card in that deck. It's the Northshire Cleric or whatever in a priest deck, or it's the Fire Elemental in your shaman deck. That's the first thing you're adding. And then you're adding incrementally less valuable things from there. That's why smaller decks are always better than bigger decks, is because bigger decks are those awesome finely tuned smaller decks with extra stuff added that's not as good. That's one of the reasons. But anyway, so when we look at Arcane Intellect, I just don't think the cycling is really worth anything in arena, at least, because the quality of your picks is average, and smaller decks aren't necessarily better; they're just smaller.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know that the cycling is actually worth anything in arena, whereas it might be in.
Although, yeah, I guess to me in arena, there's usually 1 or 2 bombs in your deck that you're trying to get to, and this helps you get to the bomb, and that because arena, a lot of times it depends on who gets their big draw first, right?
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah,
Okay.
I think we agree that this card is very overcosted.
And then Novice Engineer, I've looked at that card a number of ways, but when it got its nerf to become a 1/1 with the Battlecry draw card, here's the way that I look at it. The class-specific abilities for 2 mana tend to be worse than actual cards, almost always.
Mm-hmm.
I think that having a card, the Novice Engineer as a card, is worse than having it as, say, the Paladin class ability. Because as the Paladin class ability, it's not taking up a spot in your hand, whereas this thing is taking up a spot in your hand for an effect that, if you agree that it's equal to the hero abilities and that those are worse than cards, you're saying it's equal to a card that's worse than a card, and it's keeping you from having that other card in your hand to begin with. So you have to pay the tax of actually playing this thing before you get a card that was worth playing in the first place. And I just have a hard time. I would, if you're a Paladin, then this actually does nothing other than getting in the way of another card. I guess it does have a slight cycling effect, but I really don't weight that very highly, because you got bad cards in your deck too. You don't have those in constructed, but you do have bad cards in your deck in arena, often just as much as your bombs.
But even when you get a bad card, that's good, because you would have drawn that card next turn, and so your next draw could be better.
Yeah.
So, all right, so how would you compare this to something like Shiv, that is deal 1 damage, draw a card?
I think I like that more. And in part because it's just a single mana, and so it's sort of easy to fit that in.
Shiv is 2 mana.
Oh, is it 2?
Yeah,
Oh, I
it's
thought it was
same
1.
same cost, but it's deal 1 damage, draw a card instead of gain a 1/1, draw a card.
Yeah, that's a totally fair question.
Because this is basically the paladin hero ability equivalent, novice engineer, and Shiv
Right.
is the mage equivalent.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
good point. I'd never thought about that. Um, yeah, I guess I hadn't really thought about Shiv too much. I don't play Rogue too often. I think that, to be honest, I've drafted it pretty often. I think I would put it. I'd rather have the mage ability than the paladin ability, which means I think I'd rather have Shiv than novice engineer. But I think I would rather have most other cards than either of them.
That is fair enough. Yeah, I used to value Shiv fairly highly, and recently I've really gone away from it.
Yeah.
And actually, do you remember? So when we first launched Hearthstone, there was a huge debate about novice engineer versus loot hoarder versus acolyte of pain,
Uh-huh.
for which one is the best card draw. And I don't really see anybody running. Acolyte of pain actually is still run in certain decks, but I don't see anybody running novice engineer and loot hoarder, which were the two by far the most popular of the three.
I do run loot hoarder. I think loot hoarder is still good.
You do? Okay, I haven't seen
Yeah.
him in a long time.
And if novice engineer were still a 1/2, I think I'd probably still play him too, but I preferred loot hoarder before. So then when they nerfed one of the cards, they nerfed the one that was already the one I didn't prefer, which probably meant I was missing something. But I think there was a lot of synergy with like those, the panda that puts the battle cry guys back in your hand. And I think
Yeah.
there was some there. And plus the 2/1 with the death rattle, the loot hoarder, he can be silenced, and there's some tricks there to transform or polymorphed or whatever. And I've gotten to the point where I don't actually feel bad like polymorphing an acolyte of pain, because I'm like, I just robbed him of a card by doing that.
Yeah.
Even if I killed him in one fell swoop with damage, he still got to draw a card. So I'm not only neutralizing it, but I'm actually robbing him of a card by, say, polymorphing him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Anyway, so moving on. Another thing to look at cards for is versatility. And the primary example of versatility are the druid cards. A lot of the druid cards actually have choice baked in them. You get to do this or that. You get to put a 3/2 in play for 2 mana, or you can give all your creatures +1/+1. And that was great. I had a druid draft the other day, and I'm not kidding, I think I got offered like 5 of those.
Wow.
And I think I took all 5. And it was awesome because I was dropping 3/2s until I had like 2 or 3 of them, or 2 or 3 minions on the board, at which point I just switched into +1 mode, and it was insanely efficient because the 3/2 is fine. I mean, it'd be better if it was a knife juggler, but knife juggler doesn't have the ability to give +1/+1 to all your creatures instead. And it turns out that choice it's just well worth it. So you still have to evaluate each card to see if its choices are good, and they're certainly harder to evaluate. But they have a higher chance of one of their clauses sort of being especially good in whatever situation you're in.
Mm-hmm.
So another couple examples of cards with versatility. There's Inner Rage, which is one I talked about earlier. That's the warrior card. It's I talked about a card just like it, but it's a warrior card. It's 0 mana to cast, does 1 damage to a target, and gives it +2 attack. So I have a warrior enrage deck that lots of things with enrage, and also frothing berserkers. So when things take damage, especially when my own minions take like a single point of damage, my whole side is very, very happy. So that's a way to take what was meant to be a part of the cost, which is dealing a damage to something, and turn it into a benefit. And then you get the +2 attack with it as well. So it's great that I can throw it on any of my own creatures right before they attack to make them super strong. But the versatility is that if I manage to get some opposing creature down to 1 hit point, in a pinch, I can use this as a free way to apply that 1 point of damage and finish it off. Now, it's not particularly efficient to burn a whole card to do that, but there are some instances where it's the right thing to do, and it could even make a difference between you unexpectedly winning the game or not. So I've just found it's a good tool to have in your tool belt, the fact that it can perform double duty like that. Likewise, Blessing of Wisdom. We talked about this last time I was on, but it's a 1 cost card that you put on a minion, and when that minion attacks, you draw a card. Normally, you put that on your own creature as it's attacking. You've paid your 1 mana, you draw your card back, and as long as it survives another turn, then you're profiting pretty well. But its versatility comes in that you can also play it on an opposing minion that you have no chance of killing anytime soon. And you're basically saying to them, sure, you can attack me with that thing, but I want to be drawing cards like crazy if you do. And so that I look for that versatility, and that tends to make a card better than what it might otherwise look like.
Yeah, I really like versatility because a lot of times, especially in Arena, you just have no clue what you're going up against. And the more you can kind of hedge your bets and be like, okay, I'll be prepared for 2 different scenarios is really valuable. Do you put any kind of numeric value at all on versatility or try to?
I don't. I just keep it in mind, and it Inner Rage is a card that I do play sparingly as a warrior. If I've got a lot of enraged stuff and or Frothing Berserkers, I'll probably take it. Otherwise, I tend to leave it alone, or I prefer it attached to the Cruel Taskmaster. So at least I'm paying 2 mana to have a 2/2 around, and I just have the ability as a side effect.
Very cool.
Yeah. Okay, so we're nearing the end of the list, but this one's probably the meatiest subject we've touched on yet, which is what I call high versus low maintenance. And I couldn't find any other good terms for that, so I kind of invented that. But it's this notion of how finicky is this thing? How much does it ask of me in order to get its value out of it? So a really good example are vanilla creatures, which I consider very low maintenance. When you play a Chillwind Yeti, you know what you're getting. You are getting a 4/5. You're not maybe getting a 4/5, maybe lower, maybe higher. You are getting a 4/5. Period. End of story. Likewise, Arcane Intellect. One thing you can say about it is when you spend that 3 mana, you know that you are getting 2 replacement cards. You may not know how good they are, but it's not like maybe you'll draw the cards and maybe you won't, like a lot of the other card draw cards. So I consider that being low maintenance a very desirable quality. That's if something is low maintenance, like vanilla creatures, that's kind of a benefit in and of itself. You can't screw it up, and your enemy can't screw it up. High maintenance is the opposite of it, and high maintenance can come in many, many, many forms. But it's just the abstract notion that something might go wrong. If you're the higher maintenance a card is in your deck, the more of a potential liability it is. Now the upside of high maintenance cards is that they tend to come with a little extra power to offset that risk. But here's some examples. So one is the Ancient Watcher. We talked about it earlier. It's a 2-cost card that is or 2-cost minion. It's a 4/5, but it can't attack. Now this is to me sort of one of the extremes of a high maintenance card because on its own, it is worthless. It has to be combined with another card that knows how to get its value somehow. Like, for example, adds Taunt to it. Well, that can help. Or Silence. That's a case where silencing one of your own minions is a good thing. You remove that can't attack text, and suddenly you get a 4/5 for 2 mana. So that's pretty good. But that is an extremely high maintenance card. In fact, it's so high maintenance that I would never play with it.
Yeah.
And now here's a couple that most people think are very good, and I have cooled my jets on both of these. I mean, for a while I thought these were great, and now I devalue them and I watch when other people play them and when I play them. I actually these are some that have piqued my attention and I pay very close attention to. And one of them is Defender of Argus. So it's slow on the draw getting them up here. It's a 4 mana cost, 2/3, so not good stats, but it gives adjacent minions +1/+1 and taunt. So if you consider taunt to be worth half a mana, and the +1/+1 to be worth a full mana, then as long as it can give +1/+1 and taunt to things on both sides, then it's worth it. But if for some reason you can't, there aren't 2 other creatures on your side to put them on, then he really is not giving you your money's worth. And I feel like since I've started keeping an eye out, I've found more and more situations where I'm just not able to have 2 creatures that I want to give taunt. And that's another caveat. It's not just 2 creatures on your side. It's 2 creatures that you want to have taunt. Because part of the deal with giving taunt to creatures is the more creatures that have taunt on your side, kind of the less valuable it is. I mean, it's good for keeping guys away from you, but it's not as good for killing, or your enemy gets more choices of what they're going to attack the more things you have with taunt.
Mm-hmm.
So if I've got a Cult Master and I don't know, some other like just generic 2/2. I want to give it to the 2/2, but I don't want to give it to the Cult Master. Yeah, it'll make him a little bigger, but then they can just attack him and kill him. I'd rather protect that guy. So I just found him to be a little too conditional, and it's fine to play with him, and I see people do very good work with him, but he runs a lot of risk, and he's definitely an example of what I would call high maintenance. And then the last example I had here was Venture Company Mercenary, and this is one of the premier examples of a card that I think is too high maintenance that most people like. And this is one that I've started smiling when I see my opponents play with him, because I think to myself, how can I punish him for playing this thing? So it's a 5 mana cost, 7/6. So clearly that's very good. But it says your minions cost 3 more. So the way I look at that is, if your opponent plays this and knows that I'm not playing it, it's my opponent playing it. When my opponent plays this, if he casts even 1 minion and has to pay that 3 extra mana, let's just say that 3 mana was added to the Venture Company Mercenaries cost because it was his fault. So now you're talking about an 8 mana 7/6, which is not worth it. So if even 50% of the time, and it actually turns out, because you can make your opponent play multiple overpriced minions, which just makes this guy less and less and less efficient. Suddenly it's like 11 or 14 that you paid for the 7/6. So when my opponents cast this guy, as long as I'm not going to die to him, I try not to kill him. I try to keep him alive as long as I can to punish my enemy for playing this guy, because he's like a high maintenance girlfriend.
But if he's having to play, 3 minions, it's definitely multiple turns.
Uh-huh.
And this guy's punching you in the face for 7 for multiple turns. So sure, he's paying more for it, but he's getting a ton of value because you're just letting him punch your face.
Well, I mean, if you're playing taunt minions, or if you can freeze them, I mean, these are the kinds of things that I look for opportunities to do.
Okay.
And honestly, if I'm racing my opponent, meaning like we don't have taunt, we're just sort of trying to see who can punch each other in the face quickly. Unless we're at very low hit points, like if we're both still around 30, let your opponent keep this guy out, because you will win that race. If you're bringing even 1 turn and you've profited, but what that means is that you have to keep the Venture Company Mercenary alive through the end of your opponent's turn. So if you played this card and it's my turn, I want to not kill it. In fact, I want to create a board state to where I'm hopefully dealing damage to you, so you have to make a decision. Are you either going to hit me in the face, in which case you're not hurting my board state and I'm just going to hit you with all those things again, or are you going to attack one of my creatures to try to whittle down how much damage I'm dealing to you? And either way, that feels like kind of a win for me, because I challenge you, just observe, like try to let this guy live when your opponent plays him, try to find ways to slow him down without killing him. And especially if you've got like humility or something from a paladin deck, man, I mean, that's just ridiculous when you lower its power to 1 and he still has this ability. It hurts more than it helps. And again, I'm not trying to say never use this card, or if you use this card, that's a bad call. I mean, I personally have learned to avoid him, and I've noticed I can make my opponents suffer when they do. You can come to your own conclusions, and you may have better ways of using him. But the real point of this was just to call out that he is a high maintenance card. High maintenance cards are a thing, and that you should generally be very, very careful about playing high maintenance cards.
Yep, sounds good. I'm on board with that.
So here's a couple quick, sample choices. We've got the Dark Scale Healer, which we kind of talked about earlier. This thing is awesome. It's a 5 mana cost 4/5 with a battle cry, restore 2 health to all friendly creatures.
Okay, I like it. Yeah, I mean, sure. I think even if you're healing yourself, that's okay. If you're healing one other minion, I think you're getting your value out of it. So I don't think that's too. What's the word we're using? High maintenance.
Yeah. Okay. The Spiteful Smith, which is a 5 mana 4/6 with the enrage of your weapon has +2 attack.
So it depends on the class, right? If I'm playing rogue or warrior, maybe hunter, then it's not high maintenance. But if it's any other class, then its maintenance is out of control. It's a decent card on its own, right? But if you're trying to get the full value.
Right, exactly. If you're trying to get the full value. So that enrage effect, he's like sort of I mean, it turns out that a 4/6 I think is kind of worth playing for 5. It doesn't quite pass the vanilla test. It's just a hair shy, but 4/6 is a good mix of stats, and in a pinch, I'll often pick them. But it turns out, like in a rogue deck where you can have a weapon in hand anytime you want, that he is absolutely like super low maintenance, because you're going to get that ability anytime you want.
Yeah.
And warrior decks, you're right, you'll get it pretty often, but I don't know, maybe half the time or a third of the time you've got a weapon out as a warrior. Not really sure, somewhere in there. But in a rogue, that was part of the reason I brought that up, is because in a rogue deck he's just super low maintenance, and he's almost always very profitable.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the last one in the set is Faceless Manipulator. He's a 5 mana cost, 3/3, with a battle cry to choose a minion and become a copy of it.
So according to this test, I shouldn't like this guy. I know that 'cause he's very high maintenance, but the thing I really like about him is his high maintenance. So I don't know how to say this. His maintenance helps you when you need it most, or whatever. He's the lowest maintenance when you need help. Because when you're behind, there's stuff on the board that you want to copy because your opponent has good stuff. And so when I need him, his maintenance is low, and when I'm winning, his maintenance is high. But at that point, I don't need him.
Yeah,
so
and
I don't know. That's the way I look at him.
No, that's a really good point, and that makes a really good segue into the last item here, which is there's this notion of what is referred to as the quadrant theory. So just to do some source attribution here, this is Brian Wong sort of popularized this concept on a Magic podcast called Limited Resources,
which is an amazing podcast.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And if you listen to that, you're going to find a lot of these same sorts of concepts I'm talking about here, but for Magic, they are different for Hearthstone to some degree. But he sort of said that there are 4 different phases of the game that you need to worry about, and that cards often offer different values in those different phases. So the 4 phases are developing, which just means you're developing your board. Like on turn 1, you're casting something that costs 1 mana. And turn 2, and it assumes that if we're talking about the developing phase of the game, that you're playing a card sort of what's called on curve, which means that it's a 2 mana cost card on the second turn. The second quadrant or phase is when you're ahead in a game. The third is when you're roughly equal. And in fact, it's considered, there's often an emphasis in this one of being later in the game when you're sort of top decking, like both players are kind of evenly matched and you're both just hoping to get that really good draw. And the last phase is when you're behind in the game. And so different cards are actually good in different phases of the games, it turns out. And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time in this section because this could be probably a whole podcast in and of itself. But for what it's worth, the ahead phase, that a card is good when it's ahead, is probably the worth the least of any of those phases. And the logic kind of goes, if you're already ahead, it's probably because, I mean, you've already been playing good cards, you've already got an advantage. I mean, hell, you could often even just take a turn off or play a bad card and you're still fine. And if a card is only good when you're ahead, that's often what's referred to as a win more card, and you don't get bonus points for killing somebody an awful lot. Right? So if a card is only good when you're already ahead, that's something to watch out for. And in fact, I think that's one of the mental traps people fall in, is when they look at cards, they sort of imagine, oh my God, this card would be so good if I had like 5 minions on the board and I had this really big guy and then I gave everything like charge and wind fury. Oh man, that'd be so awesome. But you just described a board state where you had like 5 creatures and a big creature, and you probably would have won anyway. So the key is to think, I would argue, to look at the other phases of the game, especially parity and behind. Behind is one of the hardest places for a minion to be good, but if a minion is particularly good when you're behind, I think that probably gives it a little extra kick than it might get at a straight valuation. So that might help explain why you hold the Faceless Manipulator in higher esteem, is because if you're behind because they just played an Ironbark Protector, or they have some ultra buffed up minion, well, guess what? You've got one too. Yeah. And you probably paid less mana for it.
Yeah, and especially because I still don't have a lot of the legendaries. So a lot of times when I fall behind, it's because they played a legendary and I just don't have cards like that. And so this is like, oh, okay, I can have their legendary for 5 mana.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the developing stage, just to touch on that a little bit, we talked about the Young Priestess earlier. That was a 1 mana cost 2/1 that adds 1 health to another friendly random minion each turn. And that one is a good card, but it doesn't get points for being good in a developing state, I don't think, because you don't want to cast that 1 mana cost card, or at least it doesn't get its full value if you cast it on turn 1. In part because its 1 toughness makes it vulnerable to at least 2 of the classes that can kill it without a card.
Yeah.
And in part because there's no extra other minion for it to buff. So, if you did have another minion around and you brought the Young Priestess out, well, great. At the end of your turn, that other minion gets so it leaves behind a little bit of a legacy, even if it dies. So that's something. But that's just an example of a card that's not great. And in fact, a lot of spells in the game don't want to be cast on curve because a lot of the spells in the game are like killing another creature. And in fact, they often want to kill something more expensive than itself. So if you're casting, some 2 mana cost spell, if you've got that in your hand to do damage to something, well, you don't want that at the beginning of the game. It's not good in that phase of the game. And that is, again, a little bit of a high maintenance situation. It's a little bit of a liability or restriction as to when you're going to get its value.
Yeah, I run into that a lot actually with Priest, with stuff like Inner Fire, Power Word Shield, Divine Spirit, even Shadow Word Death, where it's like destroy minion with attack 5 or more. So many of those, you can't play those on curve. And it kind of fills up your deck, where I actually ran into this. I was tweaking my Priest deck today, and I have so many 1 cost things that I don't want to play on turn 1 that I don't have room for anything I want to play on turn 1.
Well, but see, I would say, don't look at those as like filling up the 1 cost part of your curve. If you're not really, because the people who build decks to have good mana curves, the main reason they're doing that is to have something to cast on turn 1 and something to cast on turn 2. But you're saying it doesn't leave room for those things that you cast on turn 1, and I would say sure they do, because they're not taking up that spot, because you don't want to cast them on turn 1. So I might be a little worried that they don't pack enough punch to be worth it if you're running a bunch of 1 mana cards. But stuff like Power Word Shield, I love, and I'll run as many as I can get. I think I had a Priest deck with like 4 of them, and it was like Christmas every turn.
Wow, yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I was never sorry to play that, but that's because it replaced itself. It's kind of a special case. Most of the other 1 cost spells aren't that great. Cool. So yeah, like I said, that we could go super deep on that, and I could give lots of examples. And in fact, I had a lot more on this subject in the notes, but I ended up nuking it because I think that high level overview is fine. And if we ever want to go deep on a different episode, that's something we can do.
Yeah, I think so. We were talking about this before the show, and I'll just throw it out there so people can chime in and say what they think. We're thinking about doing a deck building episode. So we talked about evaluating cards, but working that into the framework of, okay, you're building a deck, how do you make all these cards work together? Because sometimes you can have a lot of great cards that don't work well together. So we want to have Scott back on to talk about that hopefully soon. Yeah.
And for that matter, you guys should be tweeting Josh or emailing Josh and letting him know what you want to see. If you guys want to have me back on, I'm happy to come back on, but it'd be fun to tackle whatever subject you guys are interested in. And I love, like, this show. I did so much like research and thought on my own that doing this made me a better player. And the last time I was on, we did the Paladin and Shaman decks. And I kid you not, my first arena run after we did the How to Win an Arena with Shaman and Paladin, I went 12-1 with Shaman, and it was my first 12-win run at all. And I got it with one of the classes we discussed right after we said how to be successful with it.
Well done. It works.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, we were sharing knowledge with each other, and we had to stop and think about this stuff. So it's great. I love this.
Yeah, it's been really fun. Do you want to wrap this up with any final thoughts before we move on to the community stuff?
Yeah, I don't think so. There's a couple extra, card comparisons in the notes. I don't know if you want to put those on the website. It might be fun for the listeners to kind of go through some thought exercises that were constructed to be interesting, more than the average arena pick.
Yeah, we have 4 more like little quizzes here where there's 3 choices each and kind of talk about which one you would take. So yeah, I'll put those in the notes for sure. So you guys quiz yourself. If you think you're masters, if you've graduated from Scott's course, answer those 4 choices. You'll get a certificate in the mail. It'll be great. All right, let's jump into community question, because Nerdvana247 has a question for us. He or she says, loving the show. Seems like rogues are underpowered. I'm having difficulties with the mid-ranked matches, even with a good deck. thoughts. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, I don't play a whole lot of constructed, but I've noticed that my win rates in arena are lower than a lot of my other classes, and I do have a constructed rogue deck, and I can't. I've retooled it a couple of times, and I just can't make it work as well as say hunter, warrior, or priest, or some of these other classes. Um, my thoughts might be to move on to a different class. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, so Rogue was the first class I ever liked, and I still really like them because of cards like Sap and Assassinate. I just really like
yeah.
that control. But the really only viable Rogue deck at high-end play is Miracle Rogue, and even then, that deck is basically win or lose in one turn, which is not like it's not a super reliable strategy. You have to get the very specific combo. Well, let's compare it to with the terms they used. That deck is an extremely high maintenance deck, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so I don't know. Yeah, there's not much in Rogue if you're trying to be super competitive. But for me, I still have fun playing it. I just played in casual.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's another high maintenance card is that it's the 2 mana cost 2/2 that brings in a 2/1 if there's as a combo ability.
Oh yeah, the Defias Ringleader.
There we go. Yeah, that guy. I mean, he's super strong if you've got the coin. It's one of the best turn 1 plays you can have. But if you don't have the coin, then suddenly you find you're waiting until turn 3, 4, 5 just to be able to combo him with something. You can't play your turn 2 guy on turn 2, which again, as we just talked about, takes a little bit of value away. And so yeah, I found him to be so like condition and pun intended combo heavy.
He is combo heavy, but you're guaranteed to have that combo 50% of the time, right? Which is better than any other combo in the game you're hoping for.
Well, that's true.
Because the coin is the one card that you can count on 50% of the time. It will be in your starting hand.
Yeah, that's true.
All right, iTunes review. I was disappointed. So I've been doing around the world reviews, right? Every week, picking a new region, going to the iTunes store and looking for reviews. I'm giving a frowny face out there to Australia, Austria, China, and Japan. None of them had reviews. Even my own people in Germany, my heritage deserted me. Not a single review there. So I had to go back to the good old US of A, which had one review from Mr. Beethoven, there's some irony there because Beethoven's definitely not from the USA. He says, enjoyable podcast, 5 stars. I listened to this and the WoW Pet Battle Crew podcast, and Josh is great. I'm sure he would have said Scott was great too if he knew you were going to be here. But thank you, Mr. Beethoven.
No, you're great.
Mr. Beethoven is great. Thanks for listening to the podcast, Mr. Beethoven. We need more reviews because, or if you're in another country that I haven't checked and maybe haven't thought to check yet, please let me know where you're putting reviews. We'll read it on the show next episode, which is going to be an awesome episode, by the way. We'll talk about that in a second. But first, I want to hear Scott sing.
Oh, no. Oh, I forgot about this. All right, here we go. Card of the week.
I like it.
And by card of the week, I mean card of the strong.
Card strong. All right, this week's card, picked by Scott himself, is Soul of the Forest. It's a 4-costing druid spell, common, and it says, give your minions Death Rattle, summon a 2/2 treant, which means when the minions die, they summon a 2/2 treant. What do you think, Scott?
So, this is a card that I really, really want to be good because it's so much fun to play when it works. But it's kind of one of those high maintenance, best case, almost win more cards because looking at the mana cost, if you're getting 4/4 out of it for 4 mana, that's a little shy compared to just playing a creature. So you really need to put this on 3 creatures to break even. Even then, you don't get the treants right away. You hopefully will get them down the line if they're not, polymorphed or silenced or the game doesn't end before they die. So you really have to put this on 3 minions. And if you have 3 minions on the board, A, that's not going to happen all that often, and B, it feels like you're probably doing all right, which makes it a little more of a win more card.
Yeah, and a lot of times when I see people use this, they intentionally trade to kill their minions. So it almost kind of tricks you sometimes into making bad plays.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think it's a problem to trade them as long as you're making cost-efficient trades. But if you're suddenly playing inefficiently just to have something replace it, well, then you're just throwing value out the window
Yeah.
and you're making this an even harder sell.
Which I've definitely seen people do. I think because they're so excited just to get
Right.
make it happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, to me, this is a super situational card. Like you said, it's just high maintenance. I'd be really hesitant to pick it in arena where you don't know what you're going to get, and you usually have less minions on the board in general. I find in arena just because it's so unreliable. But there are a lot of cool death rattle effects in Naxxramas that's coming out pretty soon that I think could make it really interesting.
Yeah, that guy that gives you every death rattle effect twice.
Yeah.
That'd be cool.
Yeah, because suddenly all you need is one other minion on the board and you're getting decent value.
Yep. Yeah, that'd be super great.
But yeah, all right, so there's some potential there, but maybe like rogues, it should be kept in casual play outside of ranked.
Yeah, I wish it were like a mana cheaper or something to where it would be easier. Because if it was mana cheaper, you could feel a lot better about casting on 2 minions, and that's not quite as high maintenance, although it's still pretty bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
All right, so that is our show. We're going to have full show notes along with all of Scott's quizzes and the extra 4 choices at the end that you can go through and make your choice. There won't be answers because, like Scott said, a lot of this is subjective. There is no definitive right answer, but some are better than others. You can find all that on GameDiplomat.com. As always, swing on there, just click on Hearthstone at the top. You will get it all. Next week on the show, we're going to have another deck battle, which I'm excited. Finally, someone's going to challenge the Barbarian Hunter, who has not been challenged since he defeated Dan's Beastmaster Hunter deck. So that'll be really cool. And it's going to be Mick Montgomery, who's a very cool guy. If you don't know him, I just recorded 2 episodes of his shows with him last week. The Starting Zone, which is a WoW podcast, we talked about Rogues and the new expansion. Then on Stormcast, we talked about Heroes of the Storm, which is another of Blizzard's games. Basically, the trifecta, if you ask me. And Diablo's cool too. But WoW and Stormcast and Heroes of the Storm are my other 2 Blizzard loves. And we talked about Tyrande, which is a night elf from WoW, which doesn't have a Hearthstone card yet, but she should soon. She's really cool. She's like a priestess of the moon. Oh, actually, there is a priestess of the moon, but not a fancy enough one to be
a priestess of. There's a priestess of Elune.
Oh, okay. Yeah, same thing. Elune
Yeah,
is
okay.
like, I think they just called the moon Elune.
Ah,
Yeah, there you go. There's some WoW lore for you guys.
dropping knowledge.
Yeah. And then on the other shows I do, we just did one on Threshold, which talks about Hex, the other card game. We just did our big set review, which is something I don't think I'm going to do for Happy Hearthstone, but I'm interested to know if you guys would want to see it, which is where we all went through and we gave a grade to every single card in the entire set of Hex's first set, like A, B, C, D, F. And just kind of talked about kind of how good they are in draft, specifically, so in arena. It was a lot of work, and it's really cool, but I don't know. Would that be interesting to you as an arena drafter, Scott?
For Hearthstone,
Yeah, for Hearthstone.
I would well, I'm pretty nerdy, but I would probably listen to people's takes on it if that existed. And for what it's worth, I have been listening to the Uncommon Commons review show that you did. I'm making my way through it.
Okay. Yeah. I feel like Hearthstone, people have a pretty good opinion now. And because you have only 3 choices, it's a lot different. But yeah.
And I think this show makes a good substitution for having to go through every card, because I think it's less of a complex game and it's easier to learn how to just evaluate a card on the fly.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, so bam, Scott just did a better version right here for you guys. Yeah, so thanks for listening to the Happy Hearthstone. Oh, you can find us on Google Plus as always. Join our community. We're talking about cards and strategies and all that stuff all the time. Just go to Google Plus, search for Happy Hearthstone. You can also contact me on Twitter directly at jaugustine, or email me ajosh@outlook.com. As always, we'd love to know what you thought of this show. Like Scott said, we'd love to know what you want to hear us talk about in the future. Let us know so we can get Scott building another awesome guide like this. Scott, where can people find you?
So I'm on Twitter at Slantz76. That's SLANTZ 76. And I have been a little more active on Twitter recently. We had Wizards of the Coast come out to PopCap where I worked, and we got to play a bunch of Magic, and I tweet about that, as well as some various Hearthstone stuff. Oh, I actually did. I killed somebody with a frog. I don't know if you
you
saw
did?
that. Yep.
Oh, well done.
Yeah, we talked about that last time, and I challenged people, and somehow, it kills me because I had a gold frog and a normal frog on screen at the same time. I think he hexed a gold creature that turned into a gold frog, and for some reason, the screenshot I took was of me killing him with the normal frog. I'm like, why didn't I kill him with the gold frog? How many times is that going to happen?
Yeah, that's wow. You could have lived the dream. I've never
Yep.
killed anybody with a gold frog.
It was the what was it, that the hunter card that gave +1/+0 to all beasts?
Oh,
And it
yeah.
turns out frogs are beasts, as are sheep.
That's pretty incredible. Okay, so
Yeah.
all right, I have a new goal. I've got to kill with a golden frog.
Gold frog. That's my new challenge for myself too. And then on Twitch, I'm also Slant76, although I don't stream very often at all. And if you're interested in seeing me when I do, subscribe to my Twitter, and it hits that whenever I start streaming.
Very cool. Awesome. Scott, thanks again for all the work you did putting this guide together. It's super useful. I am definitely going to be referencing it in the future, as I know many of our listeners will be.
Cool. I'm glad to be a part of it.
All right, so everyone else, thanks again for visiting the Happy Hearthstone and having a little fun with us. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.